Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's conversations on race and policing. Today, we will be joined by Professor Dorothy Roberts talking about her new book, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. Before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Now I will turn it over to Professor Mary Texera.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that introduction. This is our 93rd. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but we're almost 100. We're moving toward 100 programs, which came out of the ashes of the death of George Floyd, as I'm sure everyone knows. But we need to occasionally remind ourselves that this is why we do this, to call attention to phenomena that is mostly found in the shadows, away from public scrutiny. And I think you will see that Professor Roberts has done this with her newest book, Torn Apart. So she's going to be discussing the child welfare system and the policing of the child welfare system. And what she calls the criminal injustice system. I have to confess that I had to walk away occasionally from this one because it was painful. It's painful to read about children and families whose lives are shattered, not because of atrocities in the home, but in many cases because they are removed from the home. She goes into the weeds to examine every aspect of a system that is designed to punish families, especially if they are Black or brown. She's an internationally recognized scholar, public intellectual, and social justice advocate. She's written and lectured extensively on the interplay of race and gender in U.S. institutions and has been a leader in transforming thinking on reproductive health, child welfare, and bioethics. She's also the author of Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare, 2002, Killing the Black Body, 1997, and Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, 2011. And more than 100 articles and book chapters, as well as co-editor of 6 books on constitutional law and gender. Currently, Professor Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights, Professor of Africana Studies, Director, Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, the University of Pennsylvania. That was a mouthful. Welcome, Professor Roberts.
Thank you so much, Professor Texera. I appreciate that very warm welcome. And I'm so grateful to be invited to speak about my book, Torn Apart, and about race and family policing in your wonderful series. And so I'm going to share my screen so that I can show my slides. There we go. And does that look okay?
Yes. Beautiful.
Okay. So I'll be talking about family policing and the carceral web, a call for abolition. And I'm going to talk about aspects of my book, Torn Apart, which is about how the so-called child welfare system, which I call a family policing system, investigates, surveils, regulates, and destroys Black families, and why we need to abolish it. For this talk, given the theme of this series, I'm going to focus in particular on how family policing is part of a broader carceral web that includes police and prisons and how they mutually reinforce each other. So I'll start with a couple stories about families that were engaged with the child welfare system that help to explain why I call it a family policing system. The first involves a woman named Angeline Montauban, who is a mother living in New York City, in Manhattan. And one morning she went into the bathroom of her home while her partner and her little boy were sleeping to call a domestic violence hotline because she wanted some help without calling the police for how to deal with the violence she was experiencing. When the person on the other line heard that she had a son, that person's attention went completely to her son, who was a toddler at the time, and she didn't offer Ms. Montauban any help at all. In fact, later that morning, that very morning, a caseworker from the New York City Administration for Children's Services showed up at the house and told Ms. Montauban that she had been accused of child neglect because she herself, Ms. Montauban, had experienced violence, even though her son had not. And because she later, after being under intense investigation by this agency, did not get an order of protection on behalf of her son. She did get one for herself. Her partner moved out the house. She had an order of protection against him, but she felt that he should continue a relationship with their son. The agency seized her son from a daycare center and put him in foster care with a stranger in the Bronx. She then went through 5 years of intense investigation and surveillance and mandated so-called services, which are just a list of tasks you have to perform before a judge finally gave her her son back. The next story involves Tyrone Denier and Saisha Mercado, who one day in 2021 were pulled over on a highway in Florida by sheriffs of the Manatee County Sheriff's Department. And these armed sheriffs demanded that the couple turn over their newborn baby, who was just days old at the time. And Ms. Mercado obviously is extremely distressed by this. She is crying, asking, "Why are you taking my baby? My baby's healthy, my baby's happy. I'm breastfeeding my baby. How are you going to feed her? Who are you giving her to?" All of these cries and pleas were completely ignored, and she was forced by armed officers to turn her baby over to the caseworkers. You can see one of them standing there as she's pleading with them to let her keep her baby. Now, why would police seize a newborn baby? Well, when Ms. Mercado was pregnant with her daughter, she was at the same time trying to transition her toddler son from breastfeeding to solid food in preparation for this new baby who was coming into the home. And he was resisting. He wasn't doing a good job of abandoning nursing. And so she was concerned about his health. And she took her son to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, for help. Like Ms. Montauban, problem in the family, she went to the people who are supposed to help you when you're in need. But instead of helping her, the hospital staff called the child abuse hotline on her and alleged that the baby was failing to thrive, or her toddler was failing to thrive, and therefore she was guilty of medical neglect. They seized her child right there in the hospital, would not let her and her partner take their child home, and now she's under investigation by the Florida Child Welfare Department. This meant that when she had the baby with whom she was pregnant at the time, she is considered a neglectful mother and under their supervision. And so that's why a sheriff's, I should say the judge issued a so-called pickup order for sheriffs to pick up the baby and hand her over to the caseworkers. She was able to get the baby back in, I think it was about 10 days, but 10 days of traumatizing this newborn and her parents. Now, the third story I will tell, which made the news, and by the way, these are all, well, the Denier Mercado story and the Jackson family made the news because advocates came out to support them, and they were covered by the media. But Ms. Montalban's story, one of the reasons she took 5 years is because her story did not make it into the media. There actually has been quite a change in media attention to family policing just in those short years. But this story of the Jackson family is one that took place near Dallas, Texas, when the Jacksons had a home birth. And their baby, when they took her to the doctor, their pediatrician, to be checked out, he determined that the baby had jaundice. They had a trained midwife who had delivered the baby, and they wanted the midwife to care for the jaundice at home. Doctor disagreed, and he called the child abuse hotline on them. Police officers arrived at their home, arrested Mr. Jackson, and seized their newborn baby and put her in foster care. Again, because of the attention of reproductive justice organization in Dallas came to their defense. They had a press conference and there was some media reporting on it. And so because of community activists, they were able to get the baby back. But that is not what happens in many cases. In many cases, like with Angeline Montalban, for absolutely no harm to a child, Black families are confronted by police officers working with caseworkers to seize children, and children spend years in foster care, sometimes, usually with strangers, sometimes with family members, but always under the supervision of this system. Also, many children, as I'll talk about later, are placed in so-called residential treatment facilities, which are very much like prisons. And so I call this family policing because it is not about protecting children or caring for children or supporting families. It's a system that operates on accusing mostly impoverished or low-income families of not caring enough for their children, investigating them intensively, supervising their lives, mandating what are euphemistically called services that most often have nothing to do with the needs of the family and aren't based on what the family says that they need. And with a large number, especially for Black and Indigenous families, removal of children from their homes and placement with strangers or in institutions called foster care, what I call a foster industrial complex. And for many families, if they do not comply under a tight time frame with all the mandates of the system, a judge will terminate the parents' rights, and that legally ends the relationship between all family members and the children. Now, this isn't an aberration. This is the fundamental way which in in which the system functions. It's also not aberrational that these families I mentioned were all Black families. As numerous studies have shown over decades, foster care is quite common in the United States, far more common than any other Western nation, and I think probably than any nation in the world, mirroring our prison system. In fact, the rates of foster care, the rates of incarceration for Black people are pretty similar and also disproportionate to white people in America. And also Native or Indigenous families are under high risk of family separation and placement of children in foster care. CPS investigation is also extremely prevalent in the United States. And I think many people think that there is no harm in an investigation. It's aimed at protecting children in their homes or finding out if children are protected or are safe or not, and then leaving if they're okay. And in fact, a majority of investigations end in unsubstantiated accusations, meaning there isn't enough evidence to pursue a case against the family. But the investigation itself is extremely traumatizing. A child welfare investigation means that government agents are coming into your home. They have the power to search every corner of it. They look in refrigerators and cupboards to see how much food is present in the home. They look for drugs and other items that they think are harmful to children. They interrogate family members, including children apart from their parents, and they strip search children to look for evidence of physical abuse, even when that isn't the allegation against the parents. And most children, most investigations and most child removals are based on neglect, which simply means not meeting some material need that children have, which is mostly because of poverty. I want to highlight one figure that was recently reported that looked at the lifetime risk that children in America have of being subject to a child welfare investigation. And it found that more than half of Black children in America will endure a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18, 53%. So I want you just to think about what that means, that the typical experience of Black children in America is to have state agents investigating their families in this traumatic way. I should add that more than 1 in 10 Black children will be removed from their homes and placed in foster care before they reach age 18. Now, I discovered this system for real. You know, I knew it existed, but I had no idea the kind of power and impact that it had on families and the racism of the system before I started doing research for my book, Killing the Black Body. And my initial research, what drew me into writing Killing the Black Body, was the prosecutions of Black women for using drugs and being pregnant. I mean, my argument was they were being prosecuted for being pregnant, and the claim, the way in which prosecutors punished them was based on their drug use and based on myths about the so-called crack baby that were circulating during the late 1980s and early 1990s. I went on to write Killing the Black Body more broadly about the devaluation of Black women's childbearing, but my initial impetus for my investigation into this was the prosecutions of Black women That led me to find out about the oppressive family policing system, because I soon learned that while hundreds of Black women were being prosecuted for being pregnant and using drugs, tens of thousands of Black women were being investigated by, turn my light back on, let's see if I can get it to click on, there we go, being investigated by Child Protective Services and having their newborn babies taken from them at the hospital. The more I looked into it, the more astounded I became. And not so much because I was surprised that the United States would have a powerful institution that was designed to punish Black people. I was aware of the prison system, for example, but I was more astounded that this wasn't a major issue for civil rights and racial justice activists. I was living in Chicago at the time, teaching at Northwestern University Law School, and I got permission to sit in on child welfare proceedings in court in Chicago. And I only saw Black families come before the court, family after family, mostly Black mothers pleading with judges to give them their children back, and judges saying, no, you can't have your children back. Your apartment still has roaches in it. So your children have to stay in foster care for another 6 months, or you missed a drug treatment session. So your children have to stay in foster care 6 more months, or your court-ordered therapist doesn't think that your cognitive deficits have improved enough. So your children have to stay in foster care 6 more months. That was the typical case. And so I concluded that if you had no idea what this system did, you would have to believe that it was designed to monitor, regulate, and punish impoverished Black families. And I wrote a book then called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, documenting the racial injustices in this system and arguing that this, like the prison system and like, every other system in America, is designed to oppress Black people. After I wrote Shattered Bonds, I became involved in numerous reform efforts. I spoke to numbers of caseworkers around the country about racial bias and racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. I wrote reports for foundations after investigating these racial disparities. I spoke with heads of child welfare departments about how to reduce the racial disparities in their systems. And for 9 years, I worked as an expert, one of 5 experts for a court that had determined in Washington State, federal court, that the state of Washington was violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care on a number of levels. The named plaintiff in that lawsuit had been moved more than 30 times while she was in foster care, from placement to placement to placement to placement. Children in Washington State in foster care were not having their school records transferred when they entered foster care, and so were missing school. Their medical records weren't being transferred. They were missing needed medical appointments and medical care. The foster parents, the foster caretakers, were not being trained in how to care for the needs of children who had medical and mental health needs. Children were running away. There was a huge problem of runaways, children escaping foster care because they couldn't take it anymore, trying to get back to their families, living in the streets. Just a number of problems that we put together a plan for the state to follow. We had benchmarks, we had meetings, and it was first supposed to last 7 years. After 7 years, we hadn't seen much progress, so we extended to 9 years. And after 9 years, we finally gave up, which is what happens around the country from these big lawsuits that try to reform these systems. There is no major change that happens. And no major change happens because the system stays fundamentally the same. It stays a system that is aimed at accusing the most marginalized families in the nation of not caring for their children and blaming them for harms to children that are actually caused by structural racism and poverty and ableism and sexism and patriarchy and other structural reasons for children's unmet needs. I also began to study the prison abolition movement, or the movement to abolish the prison industrial complex, and could see how that movement and its principles applied equally to the family policing system. And I could see how the family policing system needed to be abolished because of its fundamental oppressive design. That the cases we might hear about, either of children known to the system who are killed at home, or much more likely, children who are taken from their families and harmed in the foster system, that's much more likely than the former cases. That those aren't aberrations. They're part of the design of the system. The system is working the way it's supposed to work. The reason why Black and Indigenous families are by far the most likely to be investigated and torn apart by the system isn't an accident. It's because the system has always been designed to oppress those communities. And I also became inspired by the organizing of parents who had been entangled in the family policing system and lost their children to foster care, many of whom got their children back, but after intense trauma to their families. I was inspired by their organizing, the bravery, the courage that they have, because this system will punish you for speaking out. It will punish you for not complying with its dictates. And it takes a lot of courage for family members, especially if their children are still in the foster system, to speak out, because speaking out is considered non-compliance and a reason to keep your children in the system or to terminate your parental rights. Now, prison abolitionists have pointed out the roots of the prison system in America and the roots of criminal law enforcement in America, police, in the institution of slavery and in the white supremacist regime to re-enslave Black people after slavery ended, in slave patrols, for example, and in chain gangs and the convict leasing system after the end of the Civil War. Less known, I think, by the general public and even by abolitionists is how the family policing system has very similar roots. We can trace the practice of family separation as a means of dominating people to the system of slavery, the institution of slavery. Of course, Black parents had no legal authority over their children. Their children were legally owned by their enslavers. And so they could be separated from them. Children could be separated from their parents at the whim of the enslaver. And that did happen routinely during the institution of slavery, sometimes, as this image shows, from the auction block where family members were purchased by different enslavers and torn apart that way. Or they might be purchased separately, sold separately to punish family members, or as a gift, or to make money. And so family separation is deeply rooted in the United States from its very inception in the institution of slavery. And then when slavery ended, very similar to the way that white people wanted to take back Black labor through the prison system, they also took back Black child labor through the court-ordered child apprenticeship system. And so white enslavers only had to write a petition claiming that Black children were being neglected by their parents, and judges routinely ordered that these children, for their care, should be given as apprentices to former white enslavers. Now, the apprenticeship system existed before, but in the case of white children who are now apprenticed out, I mean, this is a bad system for everybody, but in the case of white children, they were supposed to be taught math and reading and be cared for. For Black children, it was a form of forced labor, period. And tens of thousands of Black children were returned to former white enslavers immediately after the passage of the Reconstruction amendments in the US Constitution and similar amendments in state constitutions. At the very same time, in the second half of the 19th century, the US military decided on child removal as a weapon of war against Native tribes, whom they were fighting with in the so-called Indian Wars, to dispossess them of their land and even exterminate them. And the very first instances of indigenous boarding schools in the United States were created actually in military camps for purposes of war. So child removal, far from protecting children, this is the opposite of protecting children, was weaponizing children to dispossess and exterminate Native tribes. This policy then became part of the formal child welfare system in the 20th century, with the US government and the Child Welfare League of America joining together to form what was called the adoption policy to find Native parents negligent, neglectful, and to have judges order the children removed from their homes and placed in white-dominated orphanages or be adopted into white homes. And I want to emphasize, this was not, originally it was a war effort, but it became part of the formal child welfare system in America. And then even for white children, the system was always a system designed to deal with the problems of impoverished children. And so foster care was a way of taking impoverished children from their slum communities. This all began on the East Coast. New York had some of the very first foster care programs, and placing them with more privileged families where they worked for free for these families. And thousands of them were also put on so-called orphan trains, even though in most cases their parents weren't dead, they were just impoverished, and shipped to Midwest and Southwest farms to work for strangers. Now, this history of racist policies and racial oppression continued throughout the 20th century as a form of backlash against civil rights gains. Now, until the 1960s, Black children were mostly left out of the formal child welfare system. They were more likely, if there was a child in need, be sent to, well, just ignored altogether, or be sent into the juvenile delinquency system. And it was with the demands of the civil rights movement and the welfare rights movement that Black families began to get welfare as white families already were getting. But the suitable home requirements, the requirements that a home had to meet certain standards to get welfare, were imposed most stringently against Black families to deny them welfare. And we can see this as part of the white backlash against civil rights. Eventually, in the 1960s, there was a policy issued that if children did not have suitable homes and were not entitled to welfare, they had to be put in foster care. And we see Congress now amending Title IV of the Social Security Act to provide millions, and now it's billions of dollars of funding for impoverished children to maintain them in foster care. This is when we see Black children filling up the foster care roles. And so when I began to investigate this topic in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Black children were the largest group of children in foster care. You know, a minority of children in the United States, the largest group of children in foster care, and 4 times more likely than white children to be placed in foster care. We also see in the 1990s, I already mentioned this in relation to the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant, the proliferation of extremely disparaging stereotypes about Black women and depicting their childbearing itself as a biological threat to their own children and to the nation, and images of Black women like the so-called welfare queen having babies just to get a welfare check and not caring about them, spending the money on herself, and just passing down a depraved lifestyle to their children and being no good. You know, Black children better off anywhere than with their mothers. And these ideas supported the buildup of the foster care system, with large numbers of Black children being removed from their homes and placed in foster care. And so then by the mid-1990s, we see this confluence of carceral policies that entangle police, welfare restructuring, and the family policing system. So I think many people may know about the first 2 laws, and they haven't heard about the Adoption Safe Families Act, which was part of this trifecta of neoliberal carceral policies. So, policies that deal with racial capitalism, with the fallout of racialized capitalist policies and racialized poverty in America through carceral means. The Crime Control Law of 1994 that put more police into Black communities and funded the building of prisons, more prisons. The abolition of the federal guarantee to welfare that ended any federal entitlement to welfare so that states could impose whatever restrictions they wanted and give as stingy benefits as they wanted to families in need of support. And so today, what we really have is a behavior modification system that encourages, that really forces impoverished family caregivers to take low-wage work, pretends that getting married is the solution, and deters them through welfare policy from having children. And then only a year later, the Adoption Safe Families Act, which was supposed to deal with this exploding foster care population made up mostly of Black children, or I should say Black children were the largest group. They were not quite 50% of children in foster care, but mind you, Black children at the time were like 13, 14% of the nation's child population. So the largest group in foster care, certainly the reason why foster care was so large, it skyrocketed so much, was because of the removal of Black children. And the Adoption Safe Families Act was supposed to solve this, not by stopping the removal of Black children, not by returning Black children to their homes, but by terminating their mother's rights so that they could be adopted. Okay, do you listen to what I'm saying? This is what this policy, that I'm not making this up or interpreting it. This is explicitly what the promoters of this act said was the need for it. And this is what it does. It speeds up termination of parental rights. So the presumption is that if a child is in foster care for 15 of the last 22 months, the state should petition to terminate the parent's rights. And it gives incentives, financial incentives to states to increase the number of children adopted, with no similar incentives to return children home or keep them in their homes. And this was all passed by Democratic Congress and signed by Democrat Bill Clinton. The Adoption Safe Families Act was especially promoted by Hillary Clinton. Now, in addition to everything I've been saying about the entanglement of these carceral policies and the way in which the family policing system acts like a carceral system, it also is deeply entangled with police officers. In two of the stories I told at the beginning, I say story, I mean, these are actual experiences that families had. Police were involved in forcing the relinquishment of children over to the state. And caseworkers increasingly collaborate with police officers in a number of ways. Police officers are one of the main reporters of child abuse and neglect to child welfare agencies. They often accompany state caseworkers on searches of homes and also removal of children from homes. And they train together as well. This sign put up by JMAC for Families, a great activist organization in New York City, some cops are called caseworkers, really captures how caseworkers operate like police officers. And there's also a strong connection between prison and the family policing system. I think about it, if states are supposed to petition to terminate parental rights when a child has been in foster care for 15 months, think of the implications for incarcerated parents. And even if they're able to hold on to a relationship with their children when they get out, the kinds of surveillance that they're under by the combination of probation officers and parole officers and caseworkers makes it harder for them to care for their children and become economically self-sustaining. This is an impediment for formerly incarcerated people to be able to make a living after they're released. In some ways, in fact, caseworkers are more powerful than police because at least police are thought to abide by the Fourth Amendment. I'm not saying they always do, but at least we have a conception in our culture that they're supposed to give suspects their Miranda rights. They're supposed to have a warrant before they search your home. People know, you're supposed to say, where's your warrant? That's not the case with caseworkers, even though the Fourth Amendment applies just as much to them. Any government agent who wants to search your home is supposed to have reasonable cause to do so, and is supposed to have gotten a warrant, with a judge attesting to that. It is extremely rare that a caseworker would come to a house with a warrant. They come to a house with the threat, we're going to take your children if you don't let us in. And that's how they get in. And now police officers who accompany them come into the home without a warrant because they're coming in on almost the literal coattails of the caseworkers. I tell the story in Torn Apart about a father who was he wasn't a suspect of a crime. They were doing a child welfare investigation. And you can see this on the body cam footage of the police officer who came with the caseworker. Now the caseworker comes to the door and the police officer is hiding around the corner where the father can't see him. And when the father opens the door to the caseworker, the police officer jumps in. Now the father is frightened because this armed officer is just coming to his home and he runs out. The police officer claims his body camera fell to the ground, so all you can hear are the sounds. Police officer says, "Don't touch my taser." And then you hear the gunshot ring out. He kills the father. He kills the father. So family policing puts Black people more often in encounters with police officers in very volatile situations, where they come in to take your children away from you. Micaiah Bryant, a 16-year-old, was shot in the back by a police officer when he came to deal with a conflict going on in a foster home. So this system puts people into these conflicts. They bring in police. I start the book with the story of Vanessa Peoples, a young mother who was at a park with her family, and her toddler strayed away for a minute. She could see him before she could run after him. A stranger picked him up and is on the phone when she gets to him and says, "That's my son." The stranger will not give her back her son and is calling the police. The police arrive. Finally, Vanessa gets her son back, but the officer hands her a ticket for child abuse because her son strayed away for less than a minute. Now the caseworkers come to her house. She doesn't hear them at the door. She's down in the basement. They call police officers. I won't go through the whole story, but long and short of it, the police hogtie her. They restrain her by handcuffing her wrists behind her back, handcuffing her ankles, chaining them together for 30 minutes, carry her out the home. 7 police officers have come to her home. She's done nothing. And she ends up having to plead guilty to reckless endangerment of a child to avoid going to prison. So, and now her life is messed up. She was trained to be a nurse. She can't get a job as a nurse because she's on the child abuse registry in the state. She can't find an apartment to live in because the landlords see she's a so-called child abuser, all out of her son straying away from her at a park for less than a minute. Okay, let me keep going. I can't tell any more stories or we'll be here all night, but I mean, the horrific experiences that Black people have at the hands of this policing agency are just horrifying. Another thing that police and in the criminal punishment system and the family policing system have in common are the increasing use of high-tech resources for surveilling Black communities. As you probably know, the police are increasingly using algorithms and digital predictive technologies to find hotspots in cities where they send intense numbers of police. And of course, when you have that many police in a neighborhood, they're going to find more offenses or make up more offenses than in other parts of the city. And then they claim that that proves that their technologies were accurate. Well, child welfare departments are increasingly also hiring these same high-tech companies to surveil families using big databases and their own proprietary algorithms. Just quickly, I'm sorry, I know I'm taking more time than I thought I would, but, and you can look this up, this company, SAS, it's spelled, and their analytics for child well-being. This is just copied off of their website, but they claim that they will find data no matter where it is stored. All right, so this is confidential information that they apply these multiple analytic tools. They identify individuals using all sorts of social network and analytics, so information about their social networks, and then they have automated monitoring of families with risk scores that are calculated using these algorithms that we don't know what they are, and they alert caseworkers when risk thresholds are exceeded, so caseworkers go out and investigate these families. Black children are criminalized by this system in multiple ways. They are, by being in foster care, more likely to get involved with police. As I mentioned, Ma'Khia Bryant, one teenager shot to death by police officers while in foster care. Your children are more likely to be put in the juvenile delinquency system if they're in foster care, and they get harsher sentences if they're in foster care. There's some foster care systems right now in the United States that are keeping children in juvenile detention because they claim they can't find foster homes for them. And children have been brutalized in these so-called residential treatment facilities. I just quote on the left some ways in which children are describing how what they experience in these institutional placements. And on the right are examples of two teenagers who were killed recently by staff in residential treatment facilities as foster children. This system has a huge network of surveillance that's not only these high-tech ways, but also through what's called mandated reporting, requiring that people who are in certain professions that deal with children, doctors, teachers, social service providers, that they are supposed to report their suspicions of child maltreatment to child welfare authorities. And basically what this does is deputize civilians to act like police officers. There is so much evidence of racial bias in the way in which they suspect who is a child abuser or child maltreatment and who they report. I just put up some studies here involving pediatric fractures. Much more likely that if you bring a child to the hospital with a broken bone, if you're Black, you're going to get investigated for child abuse than if you're white. And also the testing for drugs while pregnant and reporting of Black mothers. This has been shown for decades to be extremely biased against Black pregnant people. Just a case here of a Black mother whose baby was taken in New York just this year because she smoked marijuana in violation, the taking of her child was in violation of the cannabis law that legalized marijuana in New York City. The Bronx Defenders and the law firm Allen & Porter sued ACS, and they settled with her, gave her $75,000 for the harm. I don't think that's enough, but at least there was a recognition of the harm that she endured by taking her baby away for smoking marijuana. By the way, wealthy white people boast on TV, in the media, in newspapers about smoking marijuana and other drugs and drinking in order to deal with the stress of taking care of their children. And no one comes to take their children away. This is a racist system. We also know that many families are now afraid to go to professionals who are supposed to be supporting families because they know that they are at risk of being reported and losing their children. And so this is not only racially biased, it also is structurally shaped in a way that impedes care for Black children and their families. And so as this managing attorney here in Philadelphia, where I am, of Community Legal Services for its Family Advocacy Unit, points out, her office is the only place in Pennsylvania where a mother in crisis can go and ask for help without fear of being reported to a child welfare hotline. So there is a punitive carceral logic that this system operates under, which is that the harms to children in America are caused by child maltreatment, which is considered to be caused by parental pathology and cognitive deficits in need of therapeutic cures and supervision, deterring us from the reality that most harms to children, unmet needs to children in America, is because of poverty and structural racism, structural forces, and need of social change. Okay. Malcolm X, you may know from his autobiography, experienced this system. After his father was killed, his mother was taking care of him and his siblings by herself, and what he calls the welfare people came in, accused her of not taking adequate care of them, and a judge separated them and put them in different foster homes. And he called it nothing but legal modern slavery. And he said, "I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight." And this is exactly what carceral systems do. They crush people and then they punish them because they can't manage, or they broke a law, or they're deemed neglectful under the weight of the injustices that are imposed on them. And so this is not a system that can be fixed. The reason why it causes so much harm, and I have only touched the surface of all the harm that it causes, is not because of aberrant social workers or doctors or police officers. They're all working the way that they're supposed to work under this system. It only functions by taking children away. Either they threaten to take your children away, or they take your children away and put them in a harmful system. And from the very beginning of this nation, separating children from their families has never been to protect children and keep them safe. It has always been to manage communities, to control them, to destroy them. And that's the way it works today. And so the only answer is to abolish this system. And that means to dismantle it piece by piece. I put up some examples here. Ending mandated reporting. Joyce McMillan has been, and others have been, advocating for changes in the New York State laws to give parents Miranda rights and lawyers, and ending the involuntary drug testing of patients. And at the same time, we need to reimagine how should we care for children in America. And a couple ways are mutual aid, community-based networks that actually provide the resources that families need. I also support just giving higher wages or just income to struggling families. We already know that will obviously reduce child poverty in America and reduce the numbers of children taken from their families for reasons of poverty. And then also transformative justice, which many prison abolitionists like Mariam Kaba have been explaining and promoting, finding ways to keep people safe in their homes and their communities without relying on police and prisons, and I would add separating children from their families. So I know I've gone on more than I thought I would, but I appreciate the time and the attention, and I'm happy to engage in discussion, answering any questions you might have, or hearing comments, experiences you might have as well. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Roberts. That really has given us a lot to think about. I would like to let our audience get in on some questions. I'm sure they have burning questions, because we do have a fairly large, dynamic social work department on our campus, and we have a really good reputation for doing good work. However, I do believe that you have given them alternatives. I think the only clarification or maybe enhancement is for you to maybe talk about the crack epidemic, that moral panic that we all went through in the last part of the 20th century. If you could just talk about that very briefly, and then Mike and Matt will take over the question and answer.
Sure. So in the late 1980s, there was a problem of relatively high rates of crack cocaine use, mostly in Black communities, not only in Black communities. And of course, crack cocaine wasn't the only drug used in the United States, but there was attention focused by law enforcement and public policy on crack cocaine. Now, there was a part of that attention was to mothers who smoked crack cocaine while pregnant. And there began to be reports about the large numbers of children born exposed to drugs in utero, especially crack cocaine. Now, again, no evidence that there was greater use of crack cocaine during pregnancy than any other drug during pregnancy. In fact, the evidence has always been that the use of drugs during pregnancy cuts across all income levels and all racial divisions. So it was focused, though, on Black women who smoke crack during pregnancy, which was then intensified by stereotypes about the mothers and about the babies. The medical community, the media, and policymakers promoted what we now know, well, I knew it at the time, but we now have research has shown, was a myth about the impact of crack cocaine, both on pregnant women or women in general, and on their babies. So the myth, and all of this, it's important to note that crack cocaine was used disproportionately by Black people, although not exclusively by Black people. But more importantly, the myths, the image of crack cocaine was all exclusively about Black people. So when I say women who smoke crack during pregnancy, the image of that woman was a Black woman. And they were supposed to mostly be selling sex for crack. This was the image of the pregnant crack addict, was a woman who became pregnant because she was trading sex for crack. And so she was already painted as a woman who was sexually licentious, who didn't really want to be pregnant. She didn't care about the children. She just wanted drugs. Okay, that's the first part. And then there was a myth that crack cocaine in particular deprived women of maternal instinct. It was supposed to have this peculiar chemical impact that no other drug had. Only crack had this impact on Black women. So here's this woman, sexually drug addict, sexually deviant, didn't care about her children, and chemically deprived of the ability to care for her children. So she's painted as the worst mother possible. Then you have the baby she has, the so-called crack baby, always portrayed as a Black baby, and supposedly had, again, these peculiar qualities that no other baby exposed to any other drug had. They were supposed to have medical problems that could not be fixed. But more important than that were the social problems. The crack was supposed to deprive them. I think it was the president of Boston University at the time who in a speech said they were deprived of social consciousness. So they were predicted inevitably, irredeemably, to not be able to learn in school, to become welfare dependent, and to become criminals. Crack was supposed to automatically turn them into these social monsters. And so this played into the stereotypes about Black people being prone to crime, super predators, all these images are circulating at the same time of this, this idea of the Black community. Of course, the idea that Black people are prone to crime, that's irrational, all of that. Those are long-standing stereotypes, but it was like these stereotypes on drugs, it's like really...
And don't forget about the babies in the incubators.
Yes,
you remember the images on television, yes, with the little babies?
Right. They were supposed to be shake,
yes,
uncontrollably. And this is the perversity of it, is that you are taking these children from their mothers, these babies at birth from their mothers, and putting them in the custody of the state, which meant leaving them in the hospital by and large, because there weren't enough homes to put them in. Some of them did have medical problems, but so what were these problems caused by? We now have research that has compared the children who were born to mothers who smoke crack in the same neighborhoods as children whose mothers didn't smoke crack. And guess what? They had the same problems. Why? Because the problems weren't caused by their mothers. They were caused by the poverty in their communities, by the lack of prenatal care, by the stress. All the things we're now learning are harmful to pregnancy. And we're also learning the discrimination that Black women face while pregnant. So all of this leading to poor outcomes for children, unhealthy outcomes for babies, attributed to their mother's drug use, when in fact they were caused by other factors. And in addition to that, taking these children from their mothers and boarding them. They were called border babies. I don't know if you remember that. There was this term, border babies, because they were being boarded in hospitals, just rows in cribs without care. And we know that the worst thing you can do to a newborn is take the newborn away from their mother. It causes stress to the newborn. They lose all sorts of kinds of care, physical touch that is important to the development of a newborn. And to now blame the mothers for the poor outcomes these children are experiencing, when you're either creating or intensifying it by taking them away. But again, that policy began to change as better research was done, or research at all was done, and the advocacy of reproductive justice activists pointing out that this was punishing these women for being pregnant. They were being treated more harshly than other people who use drugs, and the healthcare community pointing out that this was harmful to pregnant people because it deterred them from getting prenatal care or drug treatment for fear they'd be arrested, and harmful to the babies because you were separating them from their mothers.
Are any questions, Mike or Matt?
So we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Mhm.
So we'll try to get them quickly. The first, what would be the motive today in racially motivated actions putting children in foster homes? I think this is related to having removed Indian children in the
Yeah,
past.
yeah. Well, it is a very effective way of controlling a community and keeping it in a disadvantaged, subordinated status. It's traumatizing to families to take their children away. You know, it's traumatizing to children. Children in foster care have high rates of suicide. They have high rates of PTSD. Their education is disrupted. Their medical care is disrupted. Their social relationships are disrupted. They are at high risk of being incarcerated after they leave foster care as adults. And as I mentioned, they're at high rates of being involved in the juvenile delinquency system while they're in foster care. So one reason is to continue, and people in elites in power in America believe they have an interest in continuing to subordinate Black communities, and it's very effective at doing that in all these ways. And then the agencies, once they have investigated a family, if the family's charged with child maltreatment, they have so much power to regulate that family. And they can require the family to do all sorts of things, in order to get their children back, or to avoid their children being placed in foster care. Now, so it's a way of regulating and punishing and controlling communities. Now, why would governments in the United States want to do that? Well, ultimately, it supports the racial capitalist system we have in America, a system that values wealth over people's welfare, a system that is designed to support the wealthiest people and help them accumulate more wealth. And it's designed in a racialized way. It's designed so that, I could go on for hours about this, but, all the ways in which capitalism and racism and white supremacy interact in the United States. But let's just say that they do. Hopefully, the audience recognizes that the racial hierarchy in America intersects with the capitalist form of economy and social welfare in America. And so, what does family policing have to do with that? Well, family policing sends the message that the way to meet people's needs who cannot survive under that system of economy and social order, which perpetuates poverty and makes certain people wealthy at the expense of other people who are in poverty. Now, to maintain that, you have to have some way of dealing with the struggles of families who are in poverty or low income, that don't have enough resources to care for their children. Now, how are you, or adequately for their children? I don't want to say they don't care for their children. They love their children, but they don't have all the resources they need to care adequately for their children. The system is set up to make sure that their families like that. Okay, so now how are you going to deal with that? Not so much practically, because the family policing system doesn't practically give families the resources they need. How are you going to deal with it ideologically? How are you going to convince Americans and this is a global problem, but I'll focus on America right now. How are you going to convince Americans that we have a fair and just and equal system in America when you have children who don't even have basic needs of nutrition and housing and education and healthcare? How are you going to convince them of that? Well, you convince them of that by saying the reason they don't have those things is because they've got pathological parents who we have to punish and supervise and take their children away from them. And so I think most people in America think, oh, we have a great system to care for all these children suffering from all sorts of harms. It's called the child welfare system. And we don't need to change anything radically in the United States. We just build up our child welfare system. And in fact, when you hear of stories of tragic outcomes for children in America, the result, the answer usually isn't, oh, we need to change the system, it's not working. The answer is, oh, we need more investigations of families. We need to take more children away.
Yeah.
And that's how it functions.
My wife's a substitute teacher. And so I was going to ask a question, but I think
Sure.
This question from one of our attendees says, if mandated reporting is such a terrible thing, why at a previous job that I held, it was used to separate a white child from the white family when abuse was found on the child age 8. When asked by staff how they got the bruises on the back, and the child claims that it was from their stepfathers. Are you arguing that it is only bad against Black families or all families? And what happens if the abuse is found on the child? Should the child still stay with the family and continue getting the abuse? And so this is my question.
Yes.
So that's her question. My question, because my wife's a teacher, they have to go through, all teachers have to go through a yearly education, say that if they see or if they even think there's abuse, they need to report it.
Yeah, okay. So number one, I want to emphasize that that when you look at our child welfare system, it is relatively rare that the reason why children are taken from their homes is because it's a white child who's been physically abused. That is a small portion of children in foster care. Much more likely that children in foster care are Black children whose parents have been accused of neglecting them for failing to meet their material needs. So not to say that we shouldn't worry about children who are physically abused, but that is a small percentage of children in foster care. Most of the reporting of families by mandated reporters is not reporting physical abuse. It's reporting unmet needs of children. And so, those unmet needs of children, what happens is people think they must report an unmet need, a child without adequate housing, a child without adequate clothing or food. And what happens when those children are reported is a worse outcome for the children, because they're not, the result isn't, oh, now the family will get housing, the family will get food, the family will get clothing. No, that's not what happens. If a family is unhoused, they're not going to provide housing for the family. They're going to take the children away from the family. So the mandated reporting is a way to, oh, I see. Okay. Mandated reporting is a way of requiring people to report their suspicions of any kind of maltreatment. All right. Now, the second problem with it is that it's suspicions. They're highly biased. We know for a fact that wealthy white families, regardless of what problems their children have, it's very unlikely that their doctors are going to report them to Child Protective Services. This is a system for impoverished families. All right, I'm not saying that I never said it was only Black families. I even said, even at the height, it wasn't even mostly Black families when Black children were were the largest group. Yes, there are also lots of white families. The rates of child removal among white families is too high as well. But my point is, it's very discriminatory in the way in which these systems operate, and the experience of Black children is very different than the experience of white children. Now, let's get to the point about child abuse, physical abuse. Mandated reporting ending mandated reporting would not prevent anybody from reporting physical abuse. You don't have to be mandated to do it. If a teacher thinks that a child is being physically abused at home, they're free to report it. You don't have to mandate them to do it. What mandated reporting does is tell people they have to report suspicions. And when they do that, they end up reporting needs that families have that could be better met in other ways by providing the resources to the child. A child comes to school without adequate clothing. Provide the family with the clothing. Don't mandate that the teacher has to call a system that is now going to traumatize the family. The child comes to school with obvious bruises and reports that their stepfather, whoever the case was, is beating them. You don't need mandated reporting. You don't need mandated reporting. Think logically about this. Mandated reporting that only requires more than people have to do or think they should do. Ending it doesn't prevent anybody from reporting. So why do we need it? Why do we need it? It causes more harm than good. And we should think about it. We could, you think about, oh, well, I can think of good things that this system does. Okay, well, what about all the bad things it does? Why are we going to ignore all the harm that it causes because we can find some good things it does? What I'm saying to do is pay attention to all the harm it causes, stop all the harm it causes, and find a better way to do the good things that it does. Oh, I don't hear. Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Professor Roberts.
Sure.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I could ask 1,000 questions, and I might send you an email asking some of them.
Okay.
But I did want to recognize Akila Walk had some testimony. She says, "I just wanted to say myself and my brothers were wards of the court until we were 18. I can remember when the police came and took us out of the house. All three of us were fighting with them to let us go. The pain is real. We were raised by our grandmother. The court battle was long and it lasted some years." So that very powerful personal testimony.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And again, just to add, I would say whatever reason that Akila Walk was taken from her home, can we address that reason, support her grandmother without the battles and the trauma, provide what the family needs rather than the trauma that Akila is describing there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Take care.
You'll hear from us again.
Okay, great.
Take care. Take care, Professor Roberts.
Good
Bye-bye.
to meet you all. Bye-bye.